Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guests today are Merissa Khurma. Merissa is director of the Wilson Center's Middle East program, and Nadia Oweidat, who is a Middle East program fellow and also an assistant professor of history and security studies at Kansas State University. They join us today to discuss the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its impact on the Middle East, perceptions from the region, attitudes, and implications. Nadia and Merissa, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John. Happy to be here.
Great to have you. So I want to just ask both of you for some general observations to the degree that we can generalize, right? Because if you start to break this down by country or by age group, you might find some different results. But if you could give us just an overview, Merissa, I'll start with you. What's generally the reaction to the invasion across the region?
Thank you, John. It's a very good question because things have also shifted. So I think in the lead up to the invasion, there was a bit of a wait and see or wait and watch attitude by many governments in the region. That was very much reflected in what we read in the Arabic media, what was broadcast on various satellite channels. But primarily what you heard was that this is basically great power competition, surfacing once again in Europe, and that, Russia flexing its muscle is not necessarily a bad thing, because maybe the international community should make more room for a bipolar or multipolar world where and move away from where we are today, with the United States being the sole superpower. So that was sort of the general attitude. And then the invasion happened, and there was still hesitation to condemn the invasion or even call it an invasion. In fact, the first sort of test of that, beyond just the generic, very neutral statements about keeping the peace and stability without really pointing any fingers or noting what happened, was the UN Security Council vote, where the United Arab Emirates, which is a member, basically abstained. But then we saw a change of position with the UN General Assembly vote, where many Arab countries, the vast majority, in fact, voted for the resolution and underlined the Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. So at this point, I think there is still a wait-and-see attitude for some of the countries who have not come out and condemned it openly in a separate setting beyond just the UN General Assembly.
Mm-hmm. Nadia, the government's the wait-and-see approach that Merissa describes. What about people? What do we know about public opinion in the region as far as support for or opposition to what Russia's done?
Thank you so much for this question, John. So if you are a young user of digital media, which is practically everybody around the world right now, but especially in the Middle East, we have 80% of the population that is under 40 years old, and the digital space is where they hang out. And I just did a quick check. I've been checking, I research counter narratives. I research democratic, anti-authoritarian digital activism. And I'm really, really alarmed. What I'm seeing with the coverage of Ukraine and Russia is that, as my colleague Merissa said, there is no condemnation really of Russia. In fact, the opposite. Russia is seen as, the David that is fighting Goliath. And it is basically really a more righteous, or it's opposing the West that is consistently portrayed as evil, sinister, colonial. There's no questioning of this narrative. Now, the reason why this is really, really dangerous, we have seen already, the global community should have learned that when you disseminate and support a narrative like jihadism, the circulation of violent ideas inevitably can lead to violence on the ground. We have global terrorism all over the world, still in Africa, still in the Middle East. Why? Because somebody supported jihadi ideas. And right now, what I'm seeing is there is active support of basically the Russian narrative. And if we just continue to ignore that space, the consequences are really dire. What will happen, what I see happening, John, I've seen it in the Middle East, and I see this scenario unfolding again, is if the international community decided to ignore what these Arabic speakers are exposed to, what you could have is tens of thousands of seasoned jihadis that will come and join Russia's war against the West versus, portraying it as what it is, an unprovoked war against Ukraine. So Europe could have a Yemen or a Syria scenario right in its heart. So it's really this war of ideas. It needs to be taken seriously. And I would know, like as I monitor the Arabic space, I would know there is serious work being done when I see something different. Right now, I'm not seeing Western, pro-human rights, democratic norms. They're not being defended, represented, or even explained. And that is really dangerous for all of humanity.
Something that is striking in both of your answers is that what you're describing is a region that sees this about Russia and the United States, or maybe even larger, Russia and the West, the Davy Goliath scenario. Lost in that equation is Ukraine, and the sympathy for Ukraine itself. And on this notion that Nadia brings up about a phrase that comes to mind is the post 9/11 mantra of winning hearts and minds, right? You're suggesting that we've forgotten that idea and that we're allowing someone else to win hearts and minds in the Middle East.
John, honestly, again, I really monitor the space. I've been monitoring it for a long time. I am not, maybe there are a lot of awesome meetings taking place all over the Western world. Whatever you have in meetings, it's not translating into actual content in Arabic that I'm able to see. And when I identify grassroots digital activists that are doing brilliant work, they are being silenced and nobody is saying anything about it. And some of them are terrified. Like some of them I really wanted to feature in my book, and they came and told me, look, I'm being threatened. So I'm afraid I cannot do anything. So we may be thinking we're doing something, but unless observers were actually looking at the content, digital space is available for everybody. We can all see if something is happening or not. So it's really, I have not seen actual change on the digital space yet.
Nadia, you mentioned your book. I should give it a little plug here. It's a book in progress. You're working on it. 1 Million Clicks to Freedom is the working title, The Virtual Battlefield of Ideas in the Arabic-Speaking World. Merissa.
Right. Thanks for highlighting that. I can't wait to read it, Nadia, once it's all done. So going back to your, what about the Ukraine and what about sympathy to the Ukraine point? Because I think this is so essential. And what we have seen on social media and also in the sort of, column space in the Arabic media, questions about why there is more sympathy internationally towards Ukraine versus other conflicts that the region has seen, but primarily the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. What about the Palestinian refugees? What about the Syrian refugees? What about the war in Iraq? And suddenly, all the other sort of, all the other narratives and actual events that happened, for example, momentous, anti-war protests that happened all over Europe against the war in Iraq was suddenly forgotten. People forgot that there were people marching in the capitals of Europe, including in Washington, as well in the United States, against the war. So a lot of this has been forgotten, and this comparison, again, I agree with Nadia. This is very dangerous because this is not unique to one generation. This is something that you see across generations. There was a sense from a lot of the columns that I read in the last few weeks about Russia and the Ukraine that many Arabs see this as a Soviet matter, not as a Russia versus Ukraine matter. So Ukraine's sovereignty is not really highlighted in the equation as much. But that's a very sort of traditional view in a certain generation. But when we zoom into the youth, even recent surveys, primarily the Arab Youth Survey that is published annually, looks at who do you see as a young Arab man or a woman, who do you see as an ally versus an enemy? And more than 70% see Russia as an ally. And you ask yourself, why? What is it that Russia provides you? Does it support NGO work? Does it support media development? No, the short answer is no. So it is really fascinating to see how that narrative that Nadia highlighted is quite compelling in the minds of many, many people in the region.
Merissa mentioned something really important, which is people are not exposed right now. They're not reminded how millions and millions around the world in Western democracies fought for the war not to take place in Iraq. They don't see that. You know what else I don't see? So everybody is like, why are the Europeans being nice to the Ukrainian refugees? Well, what prevented very, very rich Arab countries from being nice to the Syrian refugees? They have all the wealth in the world, and they closed their borders. And these refugees, where did they go for that generosity? They went to Germany. There are tens of thousands, I forget the exact number right now, tens of thousands of Afghani refugees that are in America, that America helped get out. I mean, how many tens of thousands is the Gulf, actually the very rich Gulf? So they're deflecting from their own policies. I mean, they have actively armed, they have actively spread an ideology, so they deflect from their own actions, which are less than, honorable or democratic or respecting of human rights, by basically blaming the West. And, the Gulf has waged a war against a very poor country of Yemen. They have caused famine. They have caused the death of tens of thousands of children. We don't hear about this. So they are definitely understanding the importance of what are people exposed to, and they're bombarding that space and taking out or flooding any narrative that is simply asking a logical question, like what prevents you with all the wealth that you have from being a more, humane partner.
In addition to the humanitarian aspects and the perceptions, maybe one way to describe that, propaganda versus truth, or the search for truth within the propaganda, there are some measurable impacts on the region. And I'm thinking specifically of food security, and I'm thinking of oil back in the spotlight. And Merissa, you've made the point that Middle East experts and Middle East countries for a long time have been trying to create a scenario where we talk about more than just oil when we talk about Arab countries or Middle East countries. And now oil is firmly back in the spotlight.
Absolutely, it is. And it is, and we see it so clearly with what's happening currently vis-a-vis Russia and the West. I was just browsing through different outlets in the Arab media. And as we both know, it has been reported that the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE have not picked up the phone when the United States was calling, and that I guess prompted the UK Prime Minister to take a necessary and urgent Gulf tour this week and meet with the leaders of the UAE and Saudi Arabia on this very particular point. Basically lessening the dependency or removing it completely on Russia when it comes to oil and gas. And so, yes, once again, we see countries like Saudi Arabia in particular that decided to go with the OPEC plus agreement with Russia that keeps oil prices really high. And so while this benefits oil producers in the region, and those are primarily in the Gulf, the Arab states of the Gulf, it certainly is not the case in other countries like Jordan or Lebanon, for example, who are very resource scarce. And with rising fuel prices come more discontent, particularly right after a global pandemic that has impacted the economy and impacted the people. So we're going to see a lot more, a lot more activity at the grassroots level, more protests, probably not maybe this week or next week, but if this persists and people feel the pain of that, then absolutely.
You mentioned Boris Johnson's shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East, and he sat down with Mohammed bin Salman, who has been much of an international pariah since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and Johnson, the first major Western leader to sit down with him face to face. Does this present an opportunity for the Crown Prince to re-engage with the international community?
I think that was the whole point of the trip. It was to underline the importance of re-engagement and garnering more support amongst the international community, and ensuring that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates join the West, not only in agreeing to stabilize the energy markets, but also to condemn the Russian invasion. Because I think short of that UN General Assembly resolution, which, as we all know, is non-binding, but is symbolic, we did not see any direct condemnation. And I think that's where there is a lot of concern in the West.
Any expectation that there can be cooperation on oil prices?
That is a really good question. I cannot tell you that I cannot predict the future, but there certainly is a lot of, as you mentioned, shuttle diplomacy. And again, there are shifts in how the region engages with the rest of the world, because the new reality is that, well, it's not just the United States. There was always a perception, and I'm sure, Nadia, this is something that you picked up also in the digital space, that the US has been slowly withdrawing from the region. I think Afghanistan and the images of Afghanistan last summer really highlighted that. And so, many countries in the region have had to sort of put their eggs in different baskets, and that included the Russia basket. So that's what we're dealing with right now.
Nadia, on the question of food security, when you look around the information ecosphere, and there's this choosing of sides, some of it based on response to propaganda or disinformation, some of it based on just deep-seated feelings about the United States or the Western countries. Is there a discussion of how much reliance Middle East countries have on Ukraine and Russia as a source of wheat and other commodities?
I mean, there is a little bit of mention of that, but if I may just follow up on something really important that Merissa shared on this diplomacy. We have always, Western countries have always prioritized short-term over long-term. So there's no strategic vision, there's no long-term vision, and that continues to basically really, Western countries continue to pay a very heavy price for this short versus long term. And for whatever reason, there's no willingness, that I've seen this in a lot of meetings I've been with when I was briefing the government, is that there's no willingness to really, and again, there may be behind closed doors, but I've never seen it. And I've been in Washington for a while. There's never been a willingness to actually have a conditional partnership. What that means is, if we are partners, I expect you to not broadcast anti-universal human rights discourse 24/7 and actually hold them accountable. Like, say, we agreed on this, so why is this anti-American discourse continuing around the clock? So there's no accountability of what our so-called allies are doing to their own population. And we have seen how interconnected we are with food security, with prices of commodities all over the world. So we're very connected, and we can no longer say, oh, they're just doing this to their population for internal reasons. There is no more internal reasons, external reasons.
It's all related. But could you be specific about it, how widespread that practice is? How many countries are we talking about? You talk about 24/7 broadcasting of these anti-American or anti-Western messages. How widespread is that?
It's really ubiquitous. It really is everywhere. Like I said to you, I just put Ukraine in Arabic, and it's one after another it was amazing. There was even going back to colonial times. And so it is everywhere. This is what I mean by, and this is very much a known Russian tactic, for example, that if there is one wise voice, what you do is you don't just put a narrative that discredits that. You flood the room with so much noise that you actually can't hear, you cannot discern, you cannot. So we really need to regulate and truly be active participant in this digital space.
Merissa, on the question of food security for the region that we began to speak about, are there countries that are particularly vulnerable to exports from Ukraine and Russia that will face the most immediate consequences if this violence continues?
Yes, there are. Like you said, we've seen wheat prices soar. There are a number of countries that are dependent on both the Ukraine and Russia, or either or. That includes Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and then Lebanon. And if we zoom into Lebanon and Yemen, those are two countries that are already experiencing food insecurity crises. Yemen is at war. And so the inability to, I guess, make that part of the narrative about the severity of this conflict in Ukraine in Arab media is quite disconcerting. I think just going back to sort of other measurable impacts, I think the other impact which has been discussed a little bit, and perhaps that helps explain that sentiment vis-a-vis, oh, why are the Ukrainians getting all this sympathy, like the refugees in particular? I think there is concern as well that other refugee populations will be forgotten because resources will be diverted to Europe. And that is not a sort of illogical concern, because many host countries in the region have been talking about donor fatigue, particularly with regards to addressing the Syrian refugee issue. So now the challenge really, for the international community is to be able to hold all of these different crises and ensure that we're not just focused on one refugee population, and think about more innovative ways, and particularly with the Ukraine issue here, to not just provide basic humanitarian needs and only focus on that, but think from now about integration into the labor markets in Europe, because we don't know how long this is going to take.
May I just add on this?
Of course.
I know I'm an intellectual historian, so ideas is my bread and butter. But I truly believe that we have a vested interest as a human community. It was Western countries that created the internet, that created all this. So we are very innovative. I have no doubt that we do have within our communities in the West, and what I mean communities in the West, I also mean people like me, like Merissa, immigrants, people who are maybe American citizens, but we bring with us, different perspectives, different languages, there is a lot of innovative people who can actually take on this war of ideas, because what do we have? What could happen if we really take on this war of ideas? What could happen if we truly educate masses all over the world on liberal norms, on civic engagement that is non-violent, on citizen rights, on human rights, on personal freedoms? I mean, the world that would be created is a lot more prosperous, a lot more stable, a lot less violent. So it is worth it for us to put our weight behind supporting these ideas.
Nadia, why don't you believe that's happening to the level that you think is needed? Have you given it that any thought? Is it complacency? Are there cultural biases involved? What are the barriers to people becoming engaged in the call to arms that you've just described?
So again, the reason why I know it's not happening is because I'm monitoring the space and I'm seeing complete degradation year after year. Why? I think one is there's no real discernment, even though we've had tens of thousands of, again, young people join the jihad. We've had massacres around the world from incitement. But at some level, there's a dismissal of the softness of soft power, even though it is power. Just because it's soft doesn't mean it's powerless. It has strong teeth. It is power. So there's a dismissal of it because, you know what? And it's actually cheap. It's a lot cheaper than weapons. And the thing is also, in American culture, I know for sure, but I also lived in Europe, there is an emphasis on like talk is cheap, or like, there's how important is it to actually, really have these debates. So that some of it is cultural. There's no, but I mean, I could ask you, like, do you have any theories? Why is it that we still haven't taken that war of ideas truly seriously?
Well, I think, maybe it's when we talk about governments, perhaps it's a failure of imagination or a failure of ability to agree on what the message would be. But certainly, if you look at the private sector, people don't underestimate the power of soft power. Hollywood movie industry, case in point.
I know that I really loved these freedoms by watching Hollywood and watching, programs like Friends. And I was like, oh, I want to be, free like that and come and go as I like. And I mean, there is power to soft power.
Yeah, I want to live in a nice New York apartment that's spacious, and I don't seem to have a job. You know, that's it, the world of television and movies. We talked, Merissa, a lot about some of the direct impact, some of the measurable direct impact, whether it's soaring oil prices or disruptions to food supplies and creating more food insecurity. What about the ripple effects in terms of indirect implications? For example, I'm thinking specifically of the ongoing attempts to finally reach agreement on a new Iran nuclear deal.
It certainly has implications on the talks on the Iranian nuclear deal, precisely because that was a priority for the Biden administration when it comes to the Middle East in particular. And then let's not forget that Russia there are Russian-Iranian relations, and both are heavily involved in the region, primarily in Syria, where Russia has been supporting President Bashar al-Assad and has strengthened his grip on power. And, in the last 2 years, when all these commemorations, the 10th and 11th anniversary commemorations have taken place of the war in Syria, the verdict was out, and the verdict was Russia won the war because of the support that they've provided. And obviously, Iran is heavily involved in also supporting Bashar al-Assad. So there are so many different connections, and this just elevates the interconnectedness of all of these different issues.
And Assad called the invasion a correction of history, right? So he clearly took the Russian version of reality. Nadia, I want to ask you, you made the point that there's the long game and the short game, and that too often you've observed that Western countries, US included, are too focused on the short term and not thinking long term. I want to ask you about, does truth find a way over time, even though what you've seen in the space of Arabic language digital communication has weighted heavily in favor of the Russian narrative? When more and more people see hospitals bombed, a theater with civilians and children in it bombed, does that begin to cut through?
No, absolutely not. Even if
it doesn't. And why is that? Why is it?
Even if you have a really, really, really mediocre idea, if it's really well supported, well oiled, you'll be amazed how many people can get behind it. So I want to point out to something that is actually, again, like we're taking for granted important solutions that we have in the West, specifically because we are liberal democracies that can actually exchange ideas. The reason why the West is incredibly the most powerful, innovative, etc., is because it has very strong civic society. Now, we need to actually, if we truly want to be allies with Arab regimes, we actually even need to educate the ruling elite on the importance of having very strong civic society. Why is that? Because, as Merissa mentioned, the important ramifications of things like lack of wheat for Egypt, which already has a lot of problems. If civic society is strong in these countries, then the one-man rule or one family rule doesn't have to solve all the problems. Civic society can basically take some of that burden. So it is actually in the interest of these countries. They don't see it like this because, again, there really is a lot of misconceptions, and a lot of regimes erroneously equate civic society with regime change. And actually, it's the opposite. Rather than have a disruption overnight, if you have very strong civic society, you can have peaceful addressing of these challenges that are inevitably coming to the region because of all this geopolitics.
Thanks. A final thought, Merissa, on this question that I just asked Nadia about sort of the short term versus the long term. Do you see anything shifting in regards to potential support for the NATO position? Are there countries that are more likely to turn their attention away from Russia and be more friendly toward the Western alliance?
I think many governments will go back to their wait and watch scenario and see how Russia fares on the ground from a military perspective, and that I think will determine where they go. Because at the end of the day, these governments are pragmatic, and the partnerships with the United States, with these countries in the region are solid and important and strategic, and they are quite deep. So I think that that's where we will be heading towards.
Thanks to both of you. And Nadia, we look forward to that book, as Merissa mentioned. When it's ready for publication, please come back and we'll talk about it, okay?
Sounds great.
Thanks to both
Thank
of you. And I hope that to our viewers that you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.